the first part of this year's series. So first we had Professor Richard Doherty, who spoke on Saint Augustine, and more precisely on human freedom, politics, and theology in the Roman world, according to Augustine. Then we had Professor Konstantin Bozinis from Thessaloniki, who was talking about St. Gregory of Nyssa, dogma and politics in Gregory of Nyssa, monarchy, democracy, kingship, tyranny, and anarchy in the Against Eunomius. Then we had the pleasure to host Dr. Andrew Fear from Manchester, who was talking on Gregory the Great, Isidore of Seville, and Hamlet's dilemma. And then lastly, we hosted Dr. Paweł Figurski from the Polish Academy of Sciences, who was talking on tyranny and freedom in the making of sacramental rulership from Charlemagne to Gregory the Seventh. So we also have here my colleague and co-organizer of those lectures, Dr. Edmund Stewart from Nottingham, who will be participating via chat tonight. And I also welcome the audience. And as you can see, this year we began with late antiquity, with Saint Augustine and Saint Gregory of Nyssa, but we arrived at the end of the 11th century, so a couple of centuries. But what's common in the authors that we heard about and discussed is that they all were Christians, whether they lived in the 4th century AD, or in the 6th century AD, or in the 11th century, or in the Carolingian period. They were all Christians, and they were all more or less interested in political philosophy, in what is tyranny and what is freedom. Last year we also talked about democracy, tyranny and democracy, because we were focusing on ancient Greece. In the Middle Ages, democracy is not prominent in the discussion of tyranny. It's not opposed to tyranny. So this time we're focusing more on tyranny and freedom, or other regimes which were contrasted and opposed to tyranny. Of course, kingship was traditionally opposed to tyranny. But I want to start with a contemporary point, because from a certain point of view, someone may ask about, what's the point in our discussing those early Christian or early medieval thinkers? What can they offer about tyranny or freedom? But when I was listening to the speech given by President Biden in Warsaw, I thought that it was a very, from the rhetorical point of view, of course, and from a political, philosophical point of view, it was very much grounded in this ancient and medieval tradition which we are discussing. Because those of you who are listening to this, or maybe read the transcript, President Biden was speaking about tyranny, even though he didn't use this word. He used the word dictator and dictatorship, but he was talking about tyranny. And first he said that democracy is what is against tyranny, but I was surprised that he, even in a stronger way, he emphasized freedom as the direct opposition of tyranny, but also the religious dimension of this speech which of course we can see as a purely conventional manner of speaking of an American president. But towards the end of the speech, he emphasized this Christian dimension, referring to God, and ending his speech with a prayer. So it was a very contemporary, of course, political event, but for me it was very much rooted in history, in the tradition, which we are studying as scholars. So that's what I found interesting in this speech. We may, of course, come back to this speech or to contemporary understanding of tyranny and freedom if you want. But I would like to start with a question to all of you as speakers. From your perspective, from the perspective of your research, what did Christianity change, or what new was brought by Christianity? Because of course, Christian religion is all about newness, and the gospel itself is proclaimed as was proclaimed and is proclaimed as something radically new. But when we study Christian culture and Christian philosophy and literature, there is a lot of there are attempts to maintain continuity with the pagan classical culture and philosophy. So there is this tension between this radical, maybe revolutionary novelty of the Christian message, and on the other hand, the attempt to ground it in the past, both in the Jewish past and in the Greco-Roman past. So what is your opinion in terms of those key concepts of tyranny, freedom, the best government or constitution or political order? How much newness there is in Christianity, and how much tradition? Maybe we can start in the chronological order from Professor Doherty, but I hope we can have some more free discussion further on. So, but Richard, could you comment on this?
Yeah, sorry, is my microphone on?
Yes, I can hear it.
Great. Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, so thank you for organizing this, Mateus. This is wonderful. I can't tell you how many notes I took from listening to the other lectures. It was, and I'm adding these to my syllabus. The readings that many of you mentioned, it was really, really enlightening for me. So I appreciate that. I guess I would say I would start by saying that I guess one of the novelties we find in early Christian thought, exemplified, I'll say, in Augustine, but Augustine is, of course, a particular voice in the early church, and not at the time, not by any means the dominant voice. That is up to his time. He becomes the dominant voice, but you know, there is early on simple opposition among many Christians to the state, viewing it as a tool of Satan, and just completely distancing oneself. Gets transformed in a way to a kind of openness to the legitimacy, of course, of political order. Much of that grounded in scriptural passages, and strikingly, you find letters from early Christians to the emperor saying, you know, we're praying for you, which is so. I will have to say, last night I did watch the movie version of Bolt's Man for. But I just, to be more particular about Augustine's view, I guess I would say two things that I think he's driving at, especially. One is the rejection of what is described as the Eusebian view, and that is the marriage of the church with the Roman Empire, and thinking that the success of the church is tied up with the success of the empire. And he speaks about this in many places, and responding in part to the despair of so many Christians at the fall of Rome in 410, in what looks like the collapse of the empire. And so that suggests a kind of distancing of the church and Christians from the political order, and yet he never counsels abandoning the political order, I would say. If one looks at, for example, that's what I would say. He never counsels abandoning the political order, but thinking of it in relative terms. So the way I would describe it is, if in the classical world, the political order was the horizon for human beings and structured that horizon, Augustine and Christianity is saying, no, it's not the political order. It's something higher. And so that results, of course, in Augustine then having to launch into a defense of the view that Christians are not unpatriotic. And, there's something to the charge. There's a reason why he takes it seriously, I think. And he has to make that argument that even though Christians understand themselves as at a distance, in a way, from the political order, it still is to be taken seriously. That it has an influence on Christian life, which is just on the community. And just one last point, I guess I would say, is that it is the case that Augustine is not nearly as concerned with the question of regime as you find certainly in Aristotle, and even in Plato or Cicero. There is, I mentioned in my talk, he deals with the question of the multiplicity of regimes in one sentence in Book 2, where he's of the City of God, where he's treating Cicero, and moves on. Now, that's not his last word, but it's a big first word, right? It's a significant first word, I think, sort of giving us an introductory sense, anyway, of how to filter the question of political order over against the importance of the spiritual order. I guess that would be my opening statement.
Okay. Thank you. Konstantin? You're muted, so you have to unmute yourself.
So, can you hear me now? It's okay? Yeah, I must say I have some technical difficulties with the connection. I hope they will not cause any problems, any serial problem. Firstly, I would like also from my part to thank you for this wonderful meeting, this panel concerning the political thought of Christianity. In my opinion, in order to better understand the Christian concept of tyranny, it is useful to examine it from 3 different points of view: the political, the psychological, and the metaphysical. Tyranny, as a term in the framework of Christianity, has all of the 3 above mentioned dimensions, because it is used in politics, as well in ethics and in metaphysics. And I will begin with the political dimension, or the political content, if you want, of the term tyranny in Christianity. I think that we have in the first place to underline the similarities between the traditional concept of tyranny and the Christian one. In the field of politics, tyranny doesn't change its basic characteristics when it is assimilated into the Christian terminology. It remains more or less the same as we know it from the ancient political philosophy. Contrary to kingship, it defines the corrupted form of monarchical constitution. It is very well known that the division of monarchy into two different forms of government that are opposed to each other, kingship and tyranny, constitutes a common topos in the Mirror of Princes and the political treatises of antiquity. Likewise, within the context of Christian political thought, monarchy is an ambivalent, I would say, term that can be understood either in a positive or in a negative manner. For tyranny slanders monarchy, but a kingdom makes it greatly desirable, as Synesius, the bishop of Cyrene, writes in his oration to the Emperor Arcadius at the beginning of the 4th century AD. Furthermore, the criteria by which tyranny is distinguished from kingship remain the same as in the Ascian War. It is very characteristic what Socrates says in the Memorabilia of Xenophon. I quote, "For government of men with their consent and in accordance with the law of the state is kingship, while government of unwilling subjects and not controlled by laws, but imposed by the will of the ruler is despotism." In the same spirit, Aristotle writes in his Ethica and Comachia, the deviation of kingship is tyranny, for though both are monarchies, they show the widest difference, since the tyrant considers his own advantage, but the king considers the advantage of his subjects. This division between kingship and tyranny, according to their distinguishing features, is repeated countless times in the official speeches delivered at the royal palace of Constantinople, in the Mirrors of Princes, in chronographies, and other works of political content that are written throughout the Middle Ages till the end of the Byzantine Empire. And it is very, very characteristic that already Eusebius of Caesarea in his Tricennial oration in honor of the first Christian Roman emperor depicts Constantine as the true king in contrast to his opponents, who are downgraded to the level of the tyrant. In Eusebius' opinion, Constantine is the true king because he enjoys the favor of the Roman people. The authority that he exercises is imposed without force on the masses of his subjects, who willingly submit to his commands, and of course they are benefited by his policy. On the other hand, the psychological dimension of tyranny is very evident in the ecclesiastical literature of the late antiquity and medieval period, especially in the moral preaching of the church fathers. The point of departure for the fathers and the Christian authors in general is, without any doubt, Plato. In their writings, we recognize without any difficulty the analysis of the power which make up the human soul from the fourth book of the Republic. That is, the mind occupies the first place, and then in hierarchical order, there is the spirited part, the thymoides, and lastly, the desiring part, the epithymetikon. According to Plato, the three parts of the soul are in a constant antagonism. The desiring part rises up against the intellect, attempting to seize the reins of the soul from its hands, while the intellect resists these attacks and struggles to subjugate the desiring part with the help of the spirit. For Plato, a man's ethical character is judged from the outcome of this battle within his soul. If the intellect imposes itself on the desires, he is rendered just and he acquires wisdom, prudence, and the other virtues. In other words, he becomes a philosopher king, having a royal soul. On the other hand, if the desiring part of the soul prevails, the natural order within man's soul is overturned, with the result that he tends toward evil. In this case, a tyranny is imposed in the inner world of men, since the irrational passions and the desires enjoy an illegitimate authority at the expense of the intellect, which is the natural ruler. According to the imagery of the Republic, kingship and tyranny represent extremes, the best and the worst in soul, perfect justice, and total injustice. It is on the basis of this Platonic scene that fathers develop their moral reflections. They describe the virtuous man who shows self-restraint and controls over his passions as a king, and on the other hand, the sinner who yields to the lawless impulses and is full of vices as a tyrant. Exactly like Socrates in the Republic, the fathers of the church believe that if desires dominate a man and usurp reason's proper place in the soul, he will search for ever more pleasure and will end up becoming through his own greed a slave to himself and a cruel tyrant towards those around him. Also, I finish here my first intervention in the discussion, highlighting not the novelties, but the similarities between the traditional concept of tyranny as we know it from the ancient world and the Christian version of it.
Okay, thank you, Konstantin. And now, Andrew.
Well, thank you very much again, Antis, for inviting me this evening. This has been a very interesting set of discussions. And your question, I think, is both pertinent and really rather difficult to answer, because I rather agree with our previous speakers that actually the distinguishing something which is absolutely separate from what has gone on in the pagan past is quite difficult. It would be hard, I think, to see disagreement with the authors we've been talking about with, say, Pliny's Panegyricus to the Emperor Trajan, in which the features of a good emperor are very much, I think, the features that we've seen praised in good kings in later times. And one, I think, also sees that on imperial propaganda. So if one looks at coins of the Roman period, we have Pax Augusta, Providentia Augusta, Abundantia, much everything that we might have expected later on is there at this time as well. Maybe we could say that Christianity, as I think Constantine pointed out, brings, and indeed Richard, a spiritual dimension, which is perhaps absent prior to that the state becomes important in terms of its pragmatics on this earth, to being something which has a purpose of promoting a better life in a different place. And perhaps one can see that in, say, Gregory's letters, where Gregory is urging secular rulers to endow new monasteries, to encourage people. Gregory, of course, gets very upset when the emperor of the day stops soldiers becoming monks, and he sees this as a downgrading of the purpose of the state. That sort of highlighting of, if you like, the two cities and saying, we mustn't prioritize the wrong one is very important. And just arguably, maybe I throw this in as an aspect of discussion and maybe just to cause trouble, is do we potentially see Christianity introduce the darker side into things here, in that the pagan world had no religious purpose? So heresy is not really something which is known to the pagan Roman Empire. But Gregory in particular is very firm that secular power should be used to suppress one form religious belief, both pagan and indeed forms of Christianity, which he calls Donatism in North Africa, which he finds unpalatable. Now, that, of course, we also have Isidore of Seville very firmly saying that one cannot convert people by force, and that the idea that King Sigismund has that one can turn Jews into Christians at the point of the sword is simply not going to work. But we do find, I think, arguably in this period, that the Christian faith can be argued to be something which can be imposed by the state, or at least things opposed to it can be closed down and ought to be closed down by the state. And in that respect, perhaps, and as I say, I simply offer this as a thought to stir up trouble. It's my only original thought in a way, because I agree very much with what the previous speakers have said, that Christianity may not always be a positive in this regard. It may also have, because of its sort of more forceful ideological take on the world, perhaps a negative influence as well.
Thank you. Thank you. And now, Paweł Figurski.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for being here. And I learned similarly a lot from the previous papers. And basically, I would agree with what was just said on the continuity and change in the contribution of Christianity to the discourse, to debating tyranny. Maybe I will try to stress some differences and rather on the positive side of things. So I will maybe try to come to Andrew's negative aspect at the end. But similarly, like in my period, in the period that I had to cover, which is like from 8th to 11th century, we see some lines of continuation with the earlier ways how tyranny was perceived, as it was based on the virtue ethics, and obviously we see this trend continuing in the Carolingian and post-Carolingian Europe. The only change, but which is obviously earlier, is the ethic that is Christian, which differs from the late antique morals in certain aspects. So I would say that if we seek for a contribution of Christianity to debating tyranny, one would be to basically stress more the Christian moral that was different from the let's say the morality of the Roman world. And in which respect? In its spiritualization, as Andrew also mentioned, that as I wanted also to convey in my lecture, in a sense that we see the image of the ideal king and the ideal type of the tyrant linked more closely with the supernatural agents. The king being the body of Christ, and his polity being the body of Christ, being embedded in the church, which is Corpus Christi. But on the other hand, the tyrant, who in the discourse, especially during the investiture contest and later on in John of Salisbury, so we are going a bit into the 12th century, is linked with the body of the devil or the likeness of the devil. So whereas the king is being perceived as the sacrament, the true just king is perceived as the sacrament, as the image of God, the tyrant is represented as the image of the devil. And these two sides of spiritualization of political order, I would say this is something that differentiates the image of kingship and tyranny from the late antique period, and especially as it is linked with special morality, Christian morality, which is, for example, taking care of the poor. When we look into the image of the king in the Carolingian or post-Carolingian era, we see more and more stress on taking care over the excluded, the widows, the poor, the orphans. It's evident in the Ordines Coronandi, the text that served during the inauguration of the royal power, but it's also evident in the practice. So it's not only a pure rhetoric, but it is so that the rulers are donating various monasteries with the aim to feed the poor. It's very often perceived as the also a way of securing one's own salvation. And this number sometimes goes into thousands, at least prescriptively, when I think emperors in the 12th century is donating Cluny. It was counted that more or less a dozen of thousand poor had to be fed according to the regulation. So this feeding of the poor and the taking care of the excluded being a way of following Christ and his image is, I would say, a specific contribution to the political order, to the Christian political order, but also to debating tyranny, because as I try to convey in my lecture, the more and more moral tasks are envisioned and required from rulers, and it's not so easy to meet the so high standards. Therefore, this moralization of kingship opens or broadens the discourse on tyranny, because it's quite easy to find the examples where a ruler is not really behaving as a proper Christian or as the one who promised to serve the poor, serve the orphans, and so on and so forth. And this leads to the demonization of those about whose some medieval intellectuals, authors, about those who are perceived as not good kings but tyrants. And I would say this would be the negative aspect that Andrew mentioned. So whereas we start with the theory of the tyrant who has to be prayerfully endured, which we end up with the 12th. Excuse me, I think somebody's microphone is on.
Sorry.
So we end up with the 12th century, in the 12th century, with the theory of tyrannicide in John's of Salisbury, which is, I would say, an effect of this demonization of the tyrant. Yeah, so I would say this would be like my first thoughts on this.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, I can see that Constantine has a question. Yeah, please.
Can I say something?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. I would like to point out that the internalization of the tyranny as a constitution of the soul that we encounter in the Church Father, in the writings of the Church Fathers, doesn't rule politics out. Yeah, I think that it's very clear. And in my opinion, it is impossible to draw a red line between the psychological and the political dimension of tyranny. In the Christian as well in the Platonic tradition, they are intermingled with each other. And we must not forget that in the Republic of Plato, the notion of justice is examined through a twofold point of view, as the order established within the soul, on the one hand, and as the principle governing the the relationship of the social classes that make up a city on the other. And of course, as the dialogue progresses, the connection between these two aspects of justice becomes more and more clear. And for Platonic Socrates, of course, justice will never prevail in the city if it is not already rooted in the soul of its citizens. This rule over the passions, let's see, is the presupposition for the proper functioning of the state. And this political axiom is adopted without any reservation by the fathers of the church. In their opinion, the soul constitutes the microcosm, let's say, of the state, and the functions carried out within it have immediate consequences in the public sphere. For instance, in describing the ideal kingship exercised by Constantine, Eusebius emphasizes in his Laus Constantini, tricennial oration, that there is only one true king, he who conquers his passions. And of course, in this tricennial oration, there is a very distinctive philosophical background. But I would like to quote a text from Dominic O'Meara, excuse me, yeah, in an article that he published recently in a collected volume that I had the pleasure to co-edit with other colleagues from Aristotle University. He makes a comparison between the Platonic Republic and Eusebius' tricennial oration. And he says, I quote, the comparison between the passages I have quoted from Eusebius and from Plato's Republic shows, I believe, that Eusebius is so close to Plato in his thinking and in his language that he must have had Plato's text in mind when he composed his oration. However, Eusebius is more likely thinking of the pagan deities that had been conquered by Constantine, an important theme in the oration. In this case, then, the contrast between the true king and tyrant is that between a king formed in the virtues of his soul by imitation of the Christian God and Christian Logos, that is Christ, and rulers who, in their vices, are in the image of and subjected to pagan divinities, demons, rulers such as Constantine's Roman predecessors, and of course Licinius, Galerius, Maximinus, and the rest of the tetrarchs with whom Constantine shared the Roman throne in the first decades of the 4th century. According to Dominic O'Meara, this is a clear distinction between the Christian and the pagan concept of Christianity. of tyranny.
Okay, thank you. I can see that Andrew Fear wanted to say something, but before we continue, and I also encourage other participants, audience, to raise their hands if you want to ask a question, or you can use chat if you have access to chat. But I don't think that people from outside our university can have access to that. But you can raise your hand if you have a question or a comment. But when I was listening to all four of you, so I thought that maybe what Christianity brought was a contradiction. So on the one hand, and I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about this. So on the one hand, Christianity says the political order is of this earth. We are speaking of a higher dimension. So this is a relativization of political power. We can have a symbolic image of, I don't know, Bishop Ambrose of Milan criticizing the Emperor Theodosius, right? So we Christians, we represent something from another world, and political powers belong to this world. And this opens up a whole possibility of transformation, conversion, spiritualization, and all of this. So this is one thing. But on the other hand, as Paweł Figurski mentioned, there is and also, of course, in the East, in the Byzantine tradition, there is this insistence that the ruler represents God. So we have Constantine the Great as the 13th apostle, and we have the medieval kings as being practically spiritual hierarchs. And so this is a contradiction, perhaps, within Christian view of politics. So on the one hand, politics belongs to the devil, we might say, right? And on the other hand, Christianity has to absorb politics, transform it. And I think it's a very important, maybe, contradiction and question, because we still encounter it, right? What is the place of Christianity in the world? Are Christians supposed to withdraw from the world, not be involved in politics, and do their thing, practice the religion completely in separation from the political order, or are they to try to impose their ideas on politics? So I think we are still caught in this, maybe in this tension or contradiction. So I'm interested in hearing your thoughts, all of you. But first, Andrew, I don't know if you wanted to comment on something that was said, or so.
Yes, no, thank you very much, Matthews. And I did, but if I may, just to join your thoughts at this point. I agree with you. There is this contradiction. It's an interesting one, I think, because if one looks at certainly the hagiography of the Visigothic period, it's very clear that the right thing to do, and maybe we see this in other hagiography as well, is that the best thing one can do is in fact withdraw from the world and enter a world of spiritual contemplation. But very often, and often for the best of reasons, such people then, if you like, shoulder their burden and come back to try and push society in the right sort of direction. And we've talked a lot about Plato this evening, and one sort of reminded of those who escape from the cave, but then feel that it is their duty to go back into the cave to try and rescue those who are remain deluded in this respect. So I think that is a tension which is always within the Christian faith, and it's very difficult to resolve. I think Paweł was quite right about Christianity's stress on what one, I suppose, could broadly call social solidarity. Although, again, I think we mustn't forget that this is present in the pagan world. Again, going back to our friend, the Emperor Trajan, his alimenta schemes of providing food for poor Romans is there and indeed celebrated on the Arch of Beneventum. But I think I would agree, and I don't know if Pavel would perhaps I'm putting words in his mouth, that this is stressed more in the Christian period, that if you like, the aims of what it is to be a good emperor have changed a little bit in that regard. And maybe another thing that's changed is that the emperor or king can now be criticized not just by individuals, so the likes of, say, Seneca having a go at Nero or something like that, but by an institution, and moreover an institution to which he is a member and to which he gives assent. So arguably the stakes in being a tyrant and the checks and ways of people being able to voice their opposition to such behavior are substantially increased by the rise of a Christian state, where, if you like, the ruler for the first time has a very serious exterior check on his behavior, or institutions can criticize it in a way where they can't simply be dismissed as sort of individual dissidents. Again, I don't know whether Pavel would agree with that, but there are just some thoughts that spring to mind.
Thank you. So perhaps now Richard Doherty and then Konstantin Bouzinis.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so Matthias, I'd like to take up this question, but I think it's related to the other one, the earlier one as well. So a couple of thoughts. One is, I think it's the case that when I read books 11 to 14 of the City of God in Augustine, I actually think of Aristotle. And I think his account of virtue there is actually quite Aristotelian, though he doesn't know Aristotle's account. It's really nature, right? So he's given an account of nature. So there's a continuity, I think, with the ancient world. But then there is the significant role, of course, for Augustine of the will, which I don't think is in Aristotle, and so there's a break. So there's a kind of newness there to Aristotle, to Augustine's argument. A second point, I think, comes in the account at the end of Book 5 of the emperor, and Augustine does say explicitly there that an emperor will be happy if he uses his authority to spread the faith. That would be a novel thing, again, right? As I think Andrew mentioned, there's no heresy charges in the ancient world. There is exile and ostracism, but not to my knowledge for religious views. Though maybe Socrates we'd have to think about in that regard. But this, to your particular point about this tension in Christianity, I think it's undoubtedly there. And so one thing that Augustine does, I think, is to emphasize the responsibility that one has for exercising power when you're in the position to do it. And surely he's thinking of himself as a bishop, being called to be a bishop, which he didn't want to do. But he just thought, well, this is what I need to do. I'm being asked to do it. And so, and it's just, and exercising that power is not, I would say, in Aristotle, one might make the argument that you feel compelled to exercise that power because you don't want to be ruled by someone who's inferior to you. That's not Augustine's argument. Augustine's argument is you have a responsibility for caring for those who are subordinate to you, right? And that's a little bit different understanding, I think, of why one is exercising rule. And a last point I would say is I really like the point that Pavel made about the demands or obligations put upon people for promoting the social teaching and social doctrine of the church. Augustine's view that here in the City of God, I think, is it's more than that. Or I'll say it's a little different from that, without excluding that. And that is he is talking about structures. I mean, he's talking about exercising political power, and so it is, I think, a little more formal in regard to the obligation for ruling, governing, judging. Without excluding the importance of the social principles. Oh, sorry, one other point I forgot. Augustine does say, this is a question I don't know the answer to. Aristotle, of course, argues against empire. And Augustine argues against empire, but I think for different reasons. And what I have not really come to grips with yet completely is there a Christian, general Christian take on the question of empire? And I just don't know. Augustine does criticize Rome. This is at the end of book 18, for having, he says it became so gargantuan it couldn't govern itself. And maybe that's just a natural question, or not in a specifically Christian understanding, though again, Aristotle also argues against empire. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Konstantin? Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
So, concerning your question, Mateusz, whether Christians should withdraw from the world or no, I have the impression that monasticism itself is not considered by the fathers of the church as a kind of withdrawal from the world, and that's why I would like to take some words about John Chrysostom, and about the images that he employs in one treatise called Against Those Who Oppose the Monastic Life. This treatise dates back to the second half of the 4th century AD and has, of course, an apologetical character. It was written because of the opposition that the monastic movement encountered in the East, as its influence began to spread among the upper classes of the society and recruit new members from the children of the well-to-do families. The monks were accused of contributing to the breakdown of the traditional social order by introducing, let's say, revolutionary ideas in the city. Chrysostom inverts this claim within a framework of fierce critique of the political realities of his days. I quote, "Everything has been turned on its head. The city where there are courts and laws is full of great iniquity and injustice, while the desert abounds with the fruits of philosophy," he remarks in a passage. The internal order of the city is likened to a tyrannical regime ruled over by a wicked demon who has conquered its acropolis, that is the souls of the citizens. It is from this place of command that each day the demon dictates his decrees to all, namely the dissolution of marriages, shady business dealings, murder, and slaughter. Chrysostom's description of the tyrannized city, tyrannoumeni poli, finds its dramatic culmination in the humiliation of the soul, which is violently separated from God and dragged off like a concubine into the tyrant's banquets to satisfy his desire. Needless to say that the demon and his companions are nothing else but personifications of the wild passions that debase men and yield power over public life. It is an image inspired, like the rest of the narrative, basically by parallel motives found in Plato's Republic. It is in this context that John announces his verdict regarding the controversial problem dividing the city. He declares that the ascetics of Mount Sipylos near Antiochia and all those of like mind throughout the empire are political exiles who have taken refuge outside the wall of the city to avoid the wicked influence emanating from the tyrannical regime within it. The monks alone offer heroic resistance to the beast, Therion, even risking their own lives to liberate souls from its teeth. That's what exactly John Chrysostom says. When monasticism is not considered by a prominent church father of the ancient church as a withdrawal from the public life or from, I don't know, from social life in general, how can we support such a view nowadays?
Thank you. I can see that Andrew Fear raised his hand. Pavel Figurski, I'm not sure if you, because I can't see you. I don't know if there is something wrong with your camera. Can you hear me, Pavel?
Yes, I can hear you. I can see you as well.
Yeah, but we can't see you for some reason.
Wow.
Do you have your camera on?
Yes, I do.
Fine. I don't know about other participants.
Okay.
Okay.
So maybe it's on your end, Mateo, or something, because I think
I can see everyone apart from you, Pavel. But okay, but I can hear you, so
Okay.
Please speak up.
I will be the voice from the darkness then on your computer. But there were many lines of thought, so let me go back to your question, and I will try to incorporate also some of the remarks of Andrew, Richard, and Constantine. So yes, for sure there is some kind of contradiction or something that I would prefer to call paradoxes in Christianity, but also I would stress this plural for paradoxes and not to seek for one Christian take or novelty or contribution to the discussion of tyranny, because as Andrew rightly recalled, there are some precedents of even Christian solidarity in the Roman era, though as we agreed, the discourse is kind of triggered and more intense in the high and early Middle Ages. But what I see in the specific Christian takes or views on the political order is that, and one kind of novelty maybe, that there is a word beyond. There is eschaton, there is a completion of this word. So it has to be, so the political order has to be relativized, if there is such a word in English. So it has to be relative. It's not finite. It's not, as Augustine says, the members of the two states, kingdoms, civitates, will be known only after the completion, and it's not possible to distinguish them, and they are not recognizable by the membership to the institutions, the earthly institutions on the way. And there are various speeds, I would say, to reach this completion. So we have the monastic movement, we have that kind of wants to get faster to its completion, and other strata of the church have other ways and other speeds, so to speak, to reach it. And I would say that there is maybe something analogous in treating the political order, that even though Carolingians and Ottonians discuss a lot the image of kingship as reflection of Christ's kingship, they are never identifying the earthly kingship with the Christ eschatological kingship. So that was also my point of my lecture, that this sacramentalization, or what was called in the earlier historiography as sacralization, is not in the in this era, 9th, 10th, 11th century. It's not about identifying the political order with Christ's eschatological kingdom. It's putting it in the framework to debate morality and a way of rulership according to Christ's rulership. That's why also kings start performing various rituals to show their vulnerability. So they want to imitate also at some point the suffering Christ, and they are stressing it. And it's a way of linking it with a different framework, the political order in those centuries, but it's never meant to identify this order. So this gap between now and then is always kept, in my sense. But there are various speeds, how close, how far you can be to this completion. And I sense that this is something that Christianity contributes to, that there is eschaton and there is a completion of this political order. So it will be never fully realized on earth.
Thank you. I want to give a voice to Andrew here, but I also would like to bring in a question, a more specific question asked by Edmund Stewart from Nottingham on our chat. So maybe Andrew, you can comment on whatever you wanted to comment and start dealing with a question raised by Edmund, which I think is also interesting. Namely, Edmund asks whether there was a change in the meaning of the tyrant as a concept, tyrannus, because in antiquity it was a specific political constitution. Tyrannus was a ruler of a polis, of a city-state. So is it the case that in the Christian and medieval era, the notion of tyrant was applied in a more wide way? So tyrant became simply an evil lord. This is a question from Edmund, rather than a specific type of political constitution. I hope, Edmund, that I didn't twist your point. But is there a widening of this concept with regard to, in comparison with ancient sources? So perhaps, Andrew, you would like to begin, and you can also raise another point as you probably wanted.
Nice thing about these conversations is that many points are raised as we go along, and it's hard to keep up with them all, isn't it? I thought Constantine, if I may, first of all, made a good point about where monks are in the world and such like. And Gregory the Great makes a very strong point that monks are what defend the empire, so to speak, and so they're clearly part of it. That said, and maybe here we see a divergent strand in even the attitude of the religious life in the Christian period. If one looks at, say, Visigothic hagiography, eremitic monasticism rather than Cenobitic monasticism is what is praised. So people go off as individuals into a wilderness. And again, those of you who are familiar with La Rioja in the north of Spain will know there are oodles of caves all over the place. So the most famous is San Millán de la Cogolla, who goes off by himself. And in the hagiography, they are very firmly described as retreating out of this world to seek a better world. So there is maybe even a tension in what it is to be holy in the Christian world. I think you, Matthias, raised a question about empire, and I noticed Richard talked about this from Augustine's perspective. Now, I don't know what Richard feels. I'd be interested to know what Richard feels about this. I don't personally think that Orosius is a pupil of Augustine. But there, very clearly, the reverse attitude is taken. Orosius regards the Roman Empire as a Christian project, and it's clearly a very good thing and should expand. And I think even Gregory the Great implies strongly that if the empire expands, it will make more people Christian, and it is therefore a good thing. Going back to what Edmund says, and I think this is very interesting notion. I'm rattling around in the back of my head at the moment, trying to think of a specific reference, but I don't have my full computer in front of me at the moment, so I can't be doing this in the background, unfortunately. But I'm pretty sure that people like Domitian and Nero are described as tyrants in the literature of the time, so that this is a word which is there. But I think Edmund puts his finger on a very interesting point, which is that this word, even in late antiquity, is not necessarily a bad word itself, is it? I have a feeling that Orosius effectively says Magnus Maximus would have been an excellent emperor, but he in fact was a tyrant, because of course the word can simply mean illegitimate ruler. I don't think in SHA, the 30 tyrants, the little chapter there, the word tyrant necessarily means bad ruler, it simply means usurper. So whether what another thing that Christianity does for us over the extent of time is that it makes this word unambiguously bad, whereas in the classical period, the word has overtones sometimes of wickedness, but it need not necessarily be a bad thing. One could be a fairly good tyrant, because the word doesn't 100% yet get infused with the notion of evil. That's just, again, musings of the moment.
Okay, so the question hanging in the air would be whether it is Christianity which made a tyrant a bad word, or not. But I wanted to emphasize another dimension which emerges here, mainly this metaphysical dimension. So it seems to me that it's also something, of course, not invented completely from scratch by Christianity, but sort of emphasized. Namely, we are speaking about demons, right? About politics, on the one hand, is this pragmatic thing, which Augustine says, well, it doesn't matter what the constitution is, I don't care. But on the other hand, politics becomes this enormously important dimension of the battle between good and evil. So again, I'm coming back to President Biden's speech, and I think I don't know, of course, what were your thoughts about this, but what struck me was how suffused by morality and metaphysics those kinds of speeches are. Of course, it's a rhetoric, it's a convention, but so the fight between tyranny and freedom is almost a cosmic fight between the forces of good and forces of darkness and God, and practically, I mean, this is clear that just as Hitler, Stalin, now Putin becomes a demonic figure in this Christian or post-Christian imagery. So is it something which existed in pagan antiquity, or is it something specifically Christian? This raising politics to this very metaphysical, moral, theological dimension. Yep. Who would like to comment on this?
Yeah, I'll respond to that, Matthias, if I could. So I wanted to actually note. So in your reference to the president's speech, there is it's certainly in well, I would say in all of American history, this is fairly common. And the way I would describe it is that the reference to when presidents, especially presidents, want to address a crucial question of sort of the highest order, it's inevitable, I think, that they're going to rely on religious language or religious imagery. I'll give one example of this from President Bush, that is George W., who routinely used religious language throughout his speeches. So this is from his 2005 State of the Union address, where he ends the address saying this: "Our generation has dreams of its own, and we also go forward with confidence. The road of providence," and in the transcript, providence is capitalized, "the road of providence is uneven and unpredictable, yet we know where it leads. It leads to freedom." That's a very interesting way of describing the goal of providence, right? It's freedom, not salvation, right? So politically, we wouldn't talk that way, right? But we do speak of freedom, which a couple people have noted comes to be a kind of used interchangeably with democracy, it seems to me, in the contemporary world. And that is, to Andrew's point, I agree with you on Orosius and Augustine. Orosius seems to me more like Dante in Book 2 of the De Monarchia, praising the Roman Empire as a kind of vehicle for the success of Christianity. And I think Augustine is just, we talked at the beginning about the relationship between the account of the soul and the account of politics. A number of people did, especially Constantine. The beginning of Book 4 of the City of God, Augustine makes that specific argument, which looks very Platonic in that sense, right out of the Republic. One last point, I guess, is on Edmund's question about tyranny and despotism. In Aristotle, in the Politics, I think he refers to tyranny routinely. Indeed, when he describes the corrupt forms of rule, the corrupt element in the democracy and oligarchy is the tyranny, and there is a tyrannical element in each of them, which leads to the worst then of the excesses, which is full-blown tyranny. But he also, in the Politics, he also gives advice to the tyrant on how to be a good tyrant. He also, of course, but it's bifurcated, right? So one is be the best tyrant possible. The other is be a king or a monarch instead. It's like, completely turn things over. It's I won't say it's amusing, but it's peculiar in any sense. In any case, but Augustine does refer when he gives that very brief catalog of regimes, he does use the word tyrant to refer to the corrupt form of the rule of the many. So it does look there like it's maybe for Augustine it's always it always implies evil, at least in every instance I can think of.
Yeah, thank you, Konstantin. Yeah. Unmute yourself.
In regard to the question of Edwards.
You mean Edmund?
Edmund, sorry. I would like to repeat that it is impossible to draw a red line between the psychological or moral and the political dimension of tyranny. And because in the Christian as well in the Platonic tradition, they are very much intermingled with each other. And as I said before, according to the speech of Socrates, to the argumentation of Socrates in the Republic, justice can never prevail in the city if it is not already rooted in the soul of its citizens. That means that we cannot separate politics from morality or psychology, the inner world of man. And especially for your remark, Mateusz, that I found very, very interesting. It is a fact that apart from the political and psychological dimension, Christian tyranny, the Christian concept of tyranny, that is tyranny within the context of Christian theology, has also a metaphysical dimension to the extent that is a notion very closely connected to the figure of Antichrist, who, according to the Christian eschatology, will appear in the end times and will impose or establish his kingdom before the second coming of the Lord. Already in the revelation of John, the kingdom of Antichrist is described as a dictatorship, that is a totalitarian government that oppress the people and deprive them of their liberty and political rights. I just want to remind a few verses from the 13th chapter of the Revelation. And if anyone refused to worship the image of the beast, he had him put to death. All alike, little and great, rich and poor, free men and slaves, must receive a mark from him on their right hands or on their foreheads, and none might buy or sell unless he carried this mark, which was the beast's name or the number that stands for his name. End quote. Following in the footsteps of the evangelists, the church fathers of the pre- and post-Constantinian period describe the regime of Antichrist as a tyranny and juxtapose it in their homilies and commentaries with the kingdom of heaven that is going to come to earth. Thus, the traditional distinction between kingship and tyranny takes a specific Christian coloring as it enters into the domain of apocalyptic and is connected with the eschatological beliefs of the church. Of course, this doesn't mean that it loses its rational political character or that is penetrated by holy ignorance and superstition. Firstly, because in the description of the end times that we encounter, whether in the New Testament or in the patristic literature, the political protest against the absolutism of the Roman Empire is easily detectable, and it is not coincidence that during the time, especially during the time of the persecutions, the imperium is identified more or less with the Antichrist. That is, in the person of a paranoid emperor like Nero, Rome is at risk of becoming a forerunner of Antichrist. And secondly, I think that is worth mentioning that we also encounter philosophical elements in the way that the fathers of the church, the fathers of the Asian church, interpret the apocalyptic prophecies. For instance, Hippolytus' description of the end times faithfully follows the Asian philosophical model of circular succession of constitutions. Hippolytus says in his commentary on Daniel that first will appear the democracies of the 10 kings. This comes from the Revelation of John. And then the tyranny of the Antichrist. Of course, he reminds us of Plato, who in Republic claims that tyranny develops out of no other regime but democracy. Furthermore, in Hippolytus' commentary on Daniel, we read the following, I quote, "For just as iron is not mixed with clay, in this way at that time men will not be able to agree with one another, but others from here and there shall carry disorder and divide the royal kingdom to themselves according to their nation." End quote. And Plato also in his Republic considers in a similar way the mixing of different metals, that is, symbols of classes, as a cause of hostility and continual conflict among the people. And I would like also to highlight the fact that according to the Church Fathers, the Antichrist is not a mythological being. He is not Satan himself. The Antichrist is a human being. And in his person, he will be magnified the arrogance, the audacity, the cruelty, the greed, and exhort all irrational passions to be unleashed in civic life through a tyrannical authority. That is, this metaphysical dimension is really something Christian. We don't find it in such a considerable degree in the ancient world, in my opinion. Yeah. But on the other hand, we discern also a tendency from the side of the Church Fathers to rationalize the eschatology of Christianity by adopting many elements that come from ancient political philosophy. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We have 4 minutes left. I just wanted to read a comment in a chat box by Christopher Joyce. An important component which Christianity introduces is the idea that all legitimate authority derives from God. The idea is there in earlier biblical literature, the Jewish scriptures, but this becomes central in the Christian idea of legitimate rule. In the light of this, is there an historical significance to the assumption of the title Basileus by the 7th century AD ruler Heraclius of Constantinople to signify that he rules with divine approval, especially in the historical context of theological controversies which were raging at the time? We don't have time to discuss this, but it's I think an important point of legitimization, or the source of power. Where does it come from? I think Christianity also gave a bit different context to it than pagan antiquity. We will have to wrap up, unfortunately, although as Andrew Fear pointed out, there were many points and many dimensions and voices in this polyphony, so we could discuss those interesting subjects for a long time, I think. And it's interesting that Konstantin Bozinis pointed out the the Antichrist and this dimension of Christian world and Christian politics, because the next lecture, which will be next Monday, I will send information soon. If you can't participate, it will also be available on YouTube. Will be delivered by Sylvain Piron from Paris, and it will be about the Pope as a tyrant in Latin Middle Ages and the Franciscan radical Franciscans believing that it's possible that the Pope will be the Antichrist. So it's also a very interesting turn of Christian history, and in fact a very important moment where the freedom of individual conscience was emphasized with this political struggle between papacy and the Franciscan order. So, but today I want to thank you for your participation, and the discussion is ongoing as we have seen. There's hardly any one point that could summarize our discussion, but I think that continuity is clear to all of our speakers. You all pointed this out in your lectures and today, that Christian thinking about politics and tyranny and freedom is deeply rooted in ancient pagan culture, but also that there are some new aspects, new emphases, and we still have to live with those emphases and those aspects in our culture today. So I think thanks to such discussions, we can understand our own world a bit better. So I thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias.
Thank you.
That's great.
So we have to stop today, but thank you, and let's stay in touch about next lectures. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. See you.
Bye.